And joining us now to debate Canada's top premiers. In Quebec City, Réal Séguin, Quebec Bureau Chief with the Globe and Mail. And with us here in studio, L. Ian MacDonald, Editor-in-Chief of Policy Options magazine. Brian Topp, former NDP leadership candidate and Executive Director of ACTRA Toronto. Janet Ecker, former Ontario Finance Minister and President of the Toronto Financial Services Alliance. Robin Sears, Senior Partner at Navigator Limited. Good to have everybody around this table. And Réal, nice to have you on the line there from Quebec City. Just to remind everybody who the top 5 premiers of the last 40 years were to celebrate Policy Options' 40th anniversary. Let's put the list up one more time if we could. Number 1, of course, as you know, Peter Lougheed. Oh, we're starting the other way. Robert Bourassa was number 5. Frank McKenna, number 4. In the 3rd spot, Alan Blakeney. Number 2, William Davis. And number 1, Peter Lougheed. Ian, to you first. You could have done anything to sort of observe the 40th anniversary of your magazine. Why'd you pick this?
40th anniversary of the Institute, to be clear, Steve, the Institute for Research on Public Policy. Well, when it was created in 1972, it was co-endowed by Ottawa and the provinces. So I thought as our tribute to the provinces, we would choose the best premier of the last 40 years and create a top 5 as well, a top 5 list as well. So what we did is we, with Tom Axworthy and Arthur Milnes, we created this questionnaire with 9 leadership attributes, and we selected a panel of 30 Canadians from coast to coast and from all walks of life, all very prominent. And the answer that came back loud and clear was Peter Lougheed, who was chosen by 21 out of 30 jurors as number 1, was on the top 5 list of all 30 jurors and swept the 9 leadership attributes. He won 9 out of 9. And it was like watching, as the results came in and were tabulated, it was like watching Secretariat win the Belmont by 31 lengths. It was just a runaway for Lougheed.
I want to call a bit of an audible if I can here, because we were going to bring these attributes up later, but since you've mentioned them now, can we bring this list up here? What makes greatness? This is Tom Axworthy's list here. What makes greatness? Let's go through this. Political winnability, the ability to persuade, to win elections, and leave a record that allows their party to thrive. On the issue of vision, run with or against the grain of history, contribute to the national debate, defend their province's interest while thinking about Canada as a whole. How about under the category of feel? Do they understand the nature of power? Do they understand how he or she or others contribute to this legacy? So that's the kind of yardstick by which these folks were judged. And I guess, Jen, I'm going to bring you in at this point. We're sitting here at TVO, which William Davis created, in the William Davis studio. You used to work for William Davis.
Yes, I did.
Do you want to recount?
Yes, actually I do. But no, I think Peter Lougheed is certainly a great Canadian, and I can quite understand why he got the attributes that he did. But I think what you saw was that there was also I'll call it a partnership, between those premiers and the federal provincial issues that they were dealing with at the time. So I think Davis certainly was very instrumental in changing the nature of this province, doing a lot of wonderful things from the GO train, the educational system. The list goes on, and I was very pleased to serve with him. The other thing, though, that I think both Mr. Lougheed and Mr. Davis and the other people on that list, they were all class acts in a way that some days in our political life, or political arenas, some days we wish we had a little bit of that back.
Robin, do they have the top 5 correct in your view?
I think so, yeah. And we were chatting about this amongst ourselves, Steve, that the question is, what was it about this period and those issues that produced so many class acts, as Janet appropriately says? And I think one of the things that is missing today, which is an important part of the process of producing a class act, because you don't get born that way necessarily, and some people need to have their bumps rubbed off, is by being able to participate in a forum with your peers in a very serious political debate in front of the Canadian electorate on an ongoing basis. These men and women, mostly men, did all that for 2 decades, almost 2 decades, again and again and again. And we've removed that from Canadian politics. And as a result of removing the whole First Minister process, I think we've removed from Canadians an opportunity to see great leaders from other provinces, and we've removed from those leaders the ability to learn at close quarters from their peers.
They were all, Steve, national figures dealing with national issues of consequence. The Constitution, energy, healthcare. And so they were all on that national, federal, provincial stage. You don't see that today.
No. Brian, do you like the list?
I like the list, and You know, there's another thing about that list that's worth remembering, which is a little bit like what some people say about where's the golden age of science fiction? People say, when you're 15.
That's right.
And these were the people who were the premiers when, you know, people of roughly our vintage were getting seriously into politics, and they were the poobahs. But another piece of the puzzle is, in some ways, that was the last generation of Canadian premiers who were builders, who had reasonable carte blanche to do things that were really impressive. In Al Blakeney's case, a remarkable job corralling the issue of resources, and also debating out what the Charter of Rights should be and demonstrating what good government is all about. And in this era of the revenge of the rentiers, you know, where the walls are closing in on government, it's just an awful lot harder for first ministers to really impress the way this generation of premiers did.
Rael, I want you to help us understand. We're going to pick away at the list now and find out why people came where they did. And I know there will be a lot of our older viewers, for example, who will remember that Robert Bourassa's first term as premier was a disaster. And Pierre Trudeau called him a hot dog eater. And yet there he is, number 5 on the list. So tell us why he's on the list.
Probably for one of the main reasons, because of the issues that all of these men had to tackle during their mandates. And Robert Bourassa, well, it was the issue of Quebec nationalism, which dominated the national agenda back in the 70s and a good part of the 80s. And I think although his first mandate, yes, it was a disaster, but keep in mind he had to deal with some of the most difficult social issues any premier had to deal with. I mean, he started off as premier dealing with the doctor strike, and that quickly turned over, and then suddenly afterwards the October crisis. Quebec nationalism's expression of, you know, was being expressed through terrorist acts. And here was a young premier trying to deal with these very, very difficult issues, while at the same time heading into a federal provincial conference a few months later in 71, redefining Quebec's place in Canada with the Victoria Accord, which he finally rejected, but largely because of the pressures put on him from this nationalist debate. And that afterwards, I mean, things went downhill for Robert Bourassa. I mean, the language issue certainly didn't help him, and this is still a major issue for Quebec. And of course, after that, allegations of illegal party financing or that as well undermined
Rael, you're helping make my point here.
So
you're helping make the point.
I know,
these
so
are all
these are
terrible
all
things. So now one of the things one of the things we do have to say, and he is perhaps, you know, truly one of the great comeback stories in Canadian political history. This is a guy who lost, looked like he was finished in his 30s, went away to Europe, came back, won the leadership again, won the premiership again.
He's his biography. You can't ask him that question.
One of the bad things that happened to Robert Bourassa in his first terms as premier was the Clich Commission, which created a couple of guys named Brian Mulroney and Lucien Bouchard. That was the first, and Robert Clich. This was the first kind of televised inquiry that was a real drama that contributed to his defeat in 1976. He was also too young the first time he was premier. He was only 36. By the time he came back from the wilderness in 1985, he was 50. He had passed his 50th birthday. He knew what he wanted to do. And don't forget, he was the father of the James Bay energy projects. That's a big achievement.
Just explain a little more about what that's all about.
That's about 30,000 megawatts in northern Quebec. It's a big deal. He was the father of the Meech Lake Accord, which was 25 years ago this week. The other premiers had so much respect for Bourassa and knew the price of failure if they didn't make that deal at Meech Lake, which was a surprise deal. And they wouldn't have made it with anyone else but Bourassa. And he was a big proponent of the free trade agreement in the 1988 federal election and sided with Mr. Mulroney. So those are 3 reasons right there for putting him in the top 5.
Robin?
But can I just challenge my friend Brian's thesis a little bit here? It's not that we don't have big issues anymore. It's not that we don't have opportunities to build and big choices to make. I mean, we're going into a whole round of new trade agreement negotiations. We're making very big choices about whether to ship energy off the west coast of Canada to Asia. Imagine how different that debate would be if there was a forum, if there were a forum, in which the premiers from all the provinces could contribute their perspective from their province's point of view and from their view of the national interest.
But those debates were a mixed blessing, though. I mean, people look at that form of executive federalism and listen to an awful lot of bickering. And you'll recall it at the end of that cycle of federalism, the people were saying maybe our system of government is broken, and maybe we needed to have a break from that approach to government. Another piece of the puzzle is that, yes, we have big issues, but the expectations of government are so much lower Because first of all, they have been execrated by 20 years of populist politics, and all of these governments are handcuffed fiscally and economically.
Janet.
Yeah. I think too that the politics of today is very much a sort of more of a self-interest. I mean, and one of the things we remember about those 5 premiers was their ability to step outside the interests of their province for the country. And yes, they had differences, and whether they were debating or bickering, I mean, they represented their provinces very, very well. But I think it would be much more difficult for leaders of any kind, or even if we brought them all back and put them in their provincial seats, for them to do the kind of leadership they did then, because your party system was different. There was a different respect for leadership. There was a different loyalty to a party, like you played a different political game. The media were different. There was just so many different things that I think supported that quality of leadership, and it's tougher to do that now, I think.
But Alison Redford, Jean Charest, and Dalton
And I
McGuinty can
think-
do a Confederation for Tomorrow conference tomorrow.
Rael, you wanted to say?
Yeah, but one of the things I find so much different today with what took place back then is perhaps the lack of vision on what kind of country the leaders here want to build at this stage. And I think that vision is quite absent. That back then, they got together, they tried to forge from all of the contentious issues that they had before them, a common vision of where the country should go. And they were facing very difficult, even insurmountable obstacles along the way. Bourassa with the nationalist issue was one of them. Peter Lougheed with the National Energy Program. I mean, these were very difficult issues, yet they were able to set aside much of their differences and try to build on this common vision for their country. We don't see much of that today. We see a vision being expressed by the current federal government, Mr. Harper's government, but nothing very much to correspond, at least correspond to or challenge that type of vision of where the country should be going.
You know, if Mr. Harper were to call a First Minister's conference on an east-west energy grid, everybody would show up for that. It'd be a heck of a conversation. And Janet just reminded me of something about Mr. Bourassa. When he died in 1996 at his state funeral, Mike Harris arrived at Notre Dame in Montreal with every living former Premier of Ontario and got a huge ovation as he walked into the cathedral. It was quite a moment.
Yeah. You see, one of the other things that I think is always difficult to assess political leadership is that you need time to assess. And I mean, you guys were teasing me a little bit about, Mike Harris, you need time to sort of reflect. You need time to see what it is that lasts of what they do. And I think one of the reasons those 5 premiers, and certainly when I think of Davis or Lougheed, so many of their accomplishments are still in place today. So many of their accomplishments are still making a big difference today. And for me, that's a true test of leader. You can have leaders who can make great change, transactional, transformative, whatever kind of leadership you want. But for me, it's like, okay, what is it like 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, down the road?
Can I talk to you, Brian, about legacy issues? Because I think obviously people in Alberta have great memories of Davis and Lougheed. Blakeney we knew less well, and yet he had vision, he had legacy as well. Fill in those blanks for us, if you would.
Well, he's got a permanent legacy in the Constitution in Section 92A, which is the Provincial Resources Clause, which was very close to his heart indeed because of a complex bunch of debates between the government of Saskatchewan and the government of Canada, but it was clearly established provinces control their resources, and that's the foundation of prosperity in Western Canada. We have a balanced Charter of Rights that takes an essentially liberal individual approach to rights and balances it against collective rights through a notwithstanding clause because Al Blakeney insisted on it. Insisted on a Canadian-style charter.
In all of the conversations we've had in this studio and around the country in the last couple of weeks about the repatriation anniversary that we've just had, it's worth remembering. Alan Blakeney insisted on that notwithstanding clause.
Absolutely.
He was the guy who wanted it.
So he was the guy who opposed a charter
Yeah.
on the argument that you don't build social democracy through liberal charters and courts. And his case was you have to persuade the public, then you pass bills in the House, and that's how you act collectively. And in his memoirs, he continues his criticism of that charter on the argument that it's an essentially liberal document that doesn't recognize collective rights. And so what it positions you to do is to have scenarios like, for example, we have in front of the U.S. Supreme Court right now, where on a similar charter, a conservative court is considering throwing out Barack Obama's health bill because of an argument on individual versus collective rights. And there was a similar decision here in Canada in the Shaluli case that arguably takes us down that road. So I was quite worried about the idea that the sovereignty was going to be taken from the people and given to courts, and he fought that fight a principled fight, and one in which, frankly, an unpopular one, but that's what we do in the NDP sometimes. And at the end of the day, he got a reasonable Canadian compromise.
The interesting thing I think about Alan's legacy in that period, and I played a minor role as a whey-faced kid, so I got to watch it fairly closely. He and Lougheed and Davis were the only things that kept Canada from spinning out of control. We would not have made it successfully to the end that we did, with whatever grievance one might have about Quebec's role, without their intervention and their key advisors. I'm not going to get into any of the names, some of them are still around, but when the federal government had a problem persuading their colleagues in any of the other provinces or in the House, it was the advisors to those three men, who were called the three wise men jocularly by those involved, who were the acid test of which way to go. And in the final analysis, it was really Alan and Lougheed. I remember one conversation at a very bitter moment where it was very close to breakdown. And
what was the issue? Can you tell us?
Let me set the story up for a second. Alan was on his balcony in a condo in Maui at midnight. And this is typically informal Alan Blakeney, and Lougheed was at his home in Edmonton. And the battle was the framing of the notwithstanding clause, and whether there was going to be any kind of weasel language in the notwithstanding clause to make it even harder to use it than it already is. And Alan was the one who, shouting at people on a conference call from his balcony in Maui, helped resolve that fight. I mean, I think, Janet, to be a little bit impolitic, sometimes you can see a pygmy and sometimes you can see a giant from the very first time you lay eyes on them. And I have to say that there are some people in Canadian politics who ain't never going to be giants.
Oh,
and
I'm not,
the
listen,
dilemma
I'm not
is not leveling
disputing.
with them.
I'm not
it's
disputing.
capacity.
No, I'm not disputing the choices. I mean, I at all. But I just think that sometimes when it is one of the assessments of great leadership is what did they accomplish years later? Because,
in 30 years, the notwithstanding clause has never been invoked by the feds, but it has been at the provincial level by Mr. Bourassa and Mr. Lougheed, among others. And what does it establish? The paramountcy of Parliament over the courts.
Yes. Which
On a temporary basis.
Yeah, on a 5-year basis.
But it's becoming.
Go ahead, Rial.
But it's becoming more and more difficult to use the notwithstanding clause, at least here in Quebec, when they wanted to use it to stop the bridging schools that allowed francophones and children from ethnic communities to attend English language schools. The government hesitated, refused to use it because of the political consequences of using the notwithstanding clause, and I guess it serves as a barrier. The political impact of using it serves as a barrier, something that was not perhaps. Well, we couldn't evaluate it back then at that time, but it certainly is a condition, and it's always been invoked here for being hesitant about using the notwithstanding clause. And we know what happened with Mr. Bourassa used it on the language and the sign issues with respect to the language law. There was quite a bit of he paid a heavy political price for using it, and perhaps contributed to the downfall of the Meech Lake Accord. Yes.
That was this design, that you use it, then you'll be accountable to the electorate. Because at the end of the day, it's not about the sovereignty of Parliament, it's the sovereignty of the public. That if a court goes down a road that the public doesn't want to go, and it is sufficiently clear that a government is willing to take the risk of using it, then you'll be held accountable. It's a footnote, by the way, of these three gentlemen.
I guess what I'm saying,
they got together.
It's often being used as an excuse.
Yeah, I hear you.
Go ahead. What I'm saying is that it's often being used as an excuse, as an excuse not to use it, rather than being a fear of what public will respond to when you use it.
Right. Brian?
I was just going to throw in a footnote about these three gentlemen. At Al Blakeney's memorial last year, the guests of honor included Premier Lougheed, who gave a lovely speech, and then Bill Davis, who gave a fabulous speech. And there we were remembering Al Blakeney. It was a sober moment. His family was there. We were pretty choked to lose him. And Bill Davis got up and gave a beautiful speech, and all the funniest times he had with Al Blakeney and with Mr. Premier Lougheed reminded us of how not only what amazing politicians these folks were, but that they were good friends.
Well, you know, that there's also, I think, the other thing about the five that have been chosen, and certainly, I mean, I had the privilege of serving on a board with Mr. Blakeney and got a chance to know him a little bit, and of course worked for Davis, as we said, but the humanity of them. I think was, you know, their ability to reach across the aisle when they needed to, and you know, Davis, I can remember experiences where Davis would be literally giving somebody heck, and they'd be eating it up, I mean, he just had this way of, with a little bit of humor and some insight and being very supportive, and still give them heck for whatever the issue was, and the ability to bring people together in consensus.
I don't want to forget about the fifth name on this top 5 list that we haven't talked at all about, because of course Lougheed elected in 71, Davis in 71, Blakeney in 71, Bourassa for the first time in 70. Frank McKenna's on this list, and he was elected in 1987 for the first time. What's Frank McKenna doing on this list, do you think?
1-800-FRANK McKenna.
Yeah, that's right.
He built the infrastructure of the modern New Brunswick and made it, brought globalization to that province. He was an outstanding premier, and he left 10 years to the day after he was first elected and said, "See you later, I'm out of here."
And that
It's
was
always
nice.
nice.
That was probably 10 years too early.
Yeah.
Because I think
Yes.
that one of the sad things about New Brunswick's trajectory since is that it hasn't been upward so much as flat, and strong leadership in a small community can make a huge difference, as he demonstrated. I don't begrudge him leaving, but I think it might have been a different New Brunswick if he'd been premier for another 10 years.
Well, and the thing that one of the things about McKenna, like he showed that one person, like with leadership, you could make a difference. That power was to be used for things, and I think, I mean, the criteria that were used, I kind of was a little bit curious about this sort of the feel for power thing, because it's not the feel for power; it's the ability to use it to make change, to do things. And some people are there, and getting power is what it's all about. Other people are there to use the power for doing something. And McKenna, certainly, I mean, all 5, but certainly Frank, he personally showed that you can take a little backwater of a province and turn it into an economic, you know, sort of powerhouse
Janet,
in this day.
obviously not planning to make her comeback in New Brunswick, but
No, well, no, but
I bet you there were some
Right.
politicians on
Well-
the panel that it would also not have escaped their notice for at least one term. He had a pretty easy time exercising power since he had
well,
won
that's right.
all
Yeah,
the seats.
that's
He
true.
won 0.
he won
That's
50
true.
He won every single seat.
In fact, he
Every
called Peter
seat,
Lougheed
yes.
after that and said, "I just beat your record."
yeah.
You know, in terms of, we referred to his, 1-800 McKenna, but on the other end of that technology, he was out at his cottage one time, and it was a party line, and the phone rang. It was the Prime Minister's office, and it was the Prime Minister to talk about the Meach amendments.
Mulrooney.
Yeah, the 1990 round. And there was 5 other people on the phone listening on the party line to this conversation between the Prime Minister and the Premier.
Well, while you've brought this up, let me follow up on that, because Frank McKenna has acknowledged a considerable amount of guilt that he's felt over the years, because he was actually the first guy that started to pick away at the Meach Lake Accord, which, it's not his fault it failed, but he started the first rumblings of this is not going to pass, and he's felt guilty about that. Do you think he made a mistake there?
Well, Richard Hatfield made the first mistake in not calling on his legislature and passing it in the summer of 1987 before his election, because Frank had opposed it, more or less. And there's no doubt that Frank feels that he was wrong about that, and tried to make up for it in the 1990 round, and did. Although Bourassa never forgot that he was the first to oppose it.
Yeah.
But the assassins at Meach Lake were guys named, Clyde Wells and Gary Doer, not Frank McKenna.
Gary Filman.
Gary Filman,
Yeah.
sorry.
Real, you wanted to say.
Gary Filman, yeah. I was just going to say that, although perhaps Mr. McKenna will probably be remembered in Quebec as being the man who shot down the Meach Lake Accord, or at least the first one to begin shooting it down, there are still remarkable gains that he made for the Acadians, I think, in New Brunswick, and a lot of the measures he took to improve bilingualism for the Francophone minority, which is quite considerable at a time when there's quite a bit of backlash against minority Francophones. I mean, I can recall in Ontario under Bill Davis, when he was Minister of Education, he did a very important step by extending financing to the Catholic separate school boards, where the majority of Francophones attended school. And then when he was Premier, he had to balance that backlash against Francophone rights against those Francophones who wanted their own schools. So he had major important battles in Sturgeon Falls, Penetanguishene. Remember Education Minister at the time, Betty Stevenson, who was against extending those rights to those Francophone school rights. But Bill Davis in the end stepped in and allowed it to happen. And I think that was perhaps one of his strengths as a national leader. And the other thing I think as well is when he undermined René Lévesque in the 1980 referendum. I can remember Bill Davis coming up and saying, remember that referendum was a two-prong affair, where they wanted to hold a referendum to negotiate sovereignty association and have a second referendum to ratify it. And Bill Davis simply said, Ontario will never negotiate. And that pretty well cleared the air on what was perhaps the major, most important weakness of that referendum battle.
I want
so
to
I think, yes.
Let me pick up, Rael, on that issue of balance that you mentioned a second ago. And Ian, I'll start this with you. Bill Davis had a balancing act that few other premiers had, insofar as for 6 years in the middle of his premiership, he was operating in a minority parliament. Yeah. And I wonder whether or not your judges took into account the skills that would have been required to pull that off in a way that obviously Peter Lougheed never had to.
Well, he was a 4-term premier, and as you said, 2 of those terms were minority legislatures over here at Queen's Park. What really struck me about the Bill Davis tenure was his kind of quiet progressivism. I mean, he made Ontario officially bilingual in all but name, but he didn't want to go down that other road because it would have been too controversial. But you go to Queen's Park to the Premier's office and there's a plate up that says Cabinet du Premier Ministre. You get your Ontario driver's license, it's bilingual. All the signs in Ontario are bilingual. Yeah. Bill Davis did that with Roy McMurtry.
Well, he was very much, I think, a politician believing in the art of the possible. But actually, I think in many ways he was a better leader because of the minority years. Because when you go back to his first term, I mean, he had a lot of challenges in that first term, and which led to that minority. And, you know, when they had scandals and dumb decisions and various things that people were quite angry when they got to 75, almost lost it. 2 years later, they sort of did some acute political trick to engineer their defeat to try and get the majority back. And they got an almost identical result back, and it was kind of like
2 more seats.
That's right. And the voters were kind of like, you know, come on, guys. And his view was basically, okay, they've told us we're going to make this work, and we're going to make this work. And in many ways, that period was probably, in my view, one of his best. You know, because he focused and he had the skill set to work in a minority legislature in a way that you don't see very often.
Brian?
And interestingly, as I'm sure you'll recall, a lot of that work was done with the New Democrat opposition.
Stephen Lewis,
who we remember him quite fondly. And
there was great
thought he
respect
was
between the
an
two of
interesting
them.
working relationship, and it's kind of an interesting moment in Canadian history that a PC government worked with the New Democrat opposition to do a fair bit of progressive stuff.
Well, what's the
It's
story?
not
Bill,
often you see, by the way, it's not often you see, on Brian's point, major league parliamentarians in provincial legislatures, and you just named 2 of them.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be unkind to any of the current players, but there was a distinct amelioration in tone coming out of the Premier's office in Ontario after Mr. Davis visited and had lunch with the current incumbent about how to manage in his circumstance. I think everybody acknowledges that Bill kind of woodshedded the current Premier a little bit about how to manage in a minority, and more power to him. It's turned out well so far. Can I just make one Al Blakeney comment about the current period versus then, Steve? Alan used to say that he saw Canada as 4 embittered have-not regions, all opposed to the rich centre. And as long as you understood that paradigm, that everybody in Canada saw themselves as embittered outliers against the centre, you could sort of figure out how to put the puzzle together. He said, I got really nervous the first time I came to Ontario and saw that they joined the have-not outliers. And I think there's a truth in that one of the things that's changed between then and now is Ontario's view of itself and Quebec's view of itself has changed, and the view of the others' view of we Central Canadians has changed. And one of the things that's missing is a generation of premiers to rebuild the federation on a more balanced footing among the regions by virtue of their personal relationships.
Well, and it'll be interesting to see what Premier Alison Redmond does in Alberta, because I agree with you. I mean, her comments coming out of a, quote, Alberta politician of having a pan-Canadian energy vision, I think most Ontarians sort of did a double take, because it's not, that's not...
It's been a long time.
It's been a long time. So, you know, there may well be a generation. There's a, you know, new leadership, and we'll see what happens.
We don't have a prime minister who's there. And that's another thing that's different. Right? Because we now have a Canadian federal prime minister dedicated to inactivity. And that you need the foil to turn provincial premiers into national figures.
Rael?
Yeah, there's one thing that I feel out of the list of the 5 people we have there, I think the one who got a bad rap throughout this was Bourassa. And certainly I think there's this naive notion that he was a trickster, that he tried to trick Quebec into thinking that he could go down the sovereignty route and played under nationalist sentiment. Certainly he used nationalism to his benefit in dealings, in all of his dealings, but I mean at no point did Bourassa deny his belief in Canadian federalism. And I remember an interview with him during the Charlottetown Accord, the referendum on the Charlottetown Accord, And at one point I asked him, well, what is it about this accord? I mean, after rejecting Victoria in 71, after the failure of the Meech Lake Accord, what was it about Charlottetown where Quebecers had to accept? Why did they have to accept this? And his answer was very simple. He says, Quebec has to stop saying no to the rest of Canada. And for him, it was a major stepping stone in order to build on that. With all the faults this accord may have had and all the criticism laid against it, he felt it was time from that moment on to start building new ties, new relations with the rest of Canada, and also building perhaps further negotiations down the road to help Quebec advance on some of the demands that it had been making for many, many years.
Ian, I want to pick up on something Peter Lougheed said in his interview. When I asked him the question about why are 4 of the 5 from that 1970s, early 80s vintage, he said, because back in that day, we premiers listened a lot more than we talked, suggesting, of course, it isn't the same today. Is he right about that?
Well, when they were in the 1970, 185 period, approximately, it was pre-internet, pre-Twitter, pre-Facebook.
Pre-cell phones.
Yeah, there weren't all these instant communications platforms that we have, enjoy today, in which, when you're managing a politician's agenda, it makes it actually more difficult to shape and control the message. But Mr. Lougheed was a master at that in his time, of the 30-second clip and the 2-minute sound bite and that sort of thing.
Mr. Davis was not.
He once said he once said he had no plans to have any plans, apropos of the conservative leadership in 1983. But I think Robin put his finger on it when he's in his piece in our special issue, Policy Options, and again here at your table here, Steve, today, about standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, they had venues, the federal provincial conferences, the first ministers' conferences, the premiers' conferences, and they were dealing with momentous issues like the Constitution, energy, you name it. We don't have that today because successive prime ministers, Chrétien and Harper, have essentially dismantled the federal provincial process.
And I think one of the missing ingredients, I agree with you, Brian, that it often looked like chitter-chatter on the television, but what is missing is the late-night drinking in the bar. The sessions that went over a whole weekend of fishing or bullshitting or telling war stories to each other that developed personal relationships at a very deep level. People had deep friendships at the leadership level, at the staff level, at the ministerial level. And I'm a great believer in Clinton and Mulroney and others' vision of leadership in this respect. When you have a deep personal relationship with somebody and you have a big political problem later on, there's a huge difference in your ability to resolve it versus your ability with a stranger.
We don't let that happen.
And we don't let it
don't
happen.
let that
Council of the
happen.
Federation. The premiers still meet every year, and they're dealing with big issues. For example, funding public Medicare and what its future is. But it's covered as footnotes in the news right now. And that's in part because the missing element is a national government that is saying that this is a national issue.
Well, Jim Flaherty pulled a press release out of his pocket in Victoria and put the healthcare consulting industry out of business, in 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's right.
But you remind me, Steve, about the late night thing. One night I was at the Ritz with Premier of New Brunswick, Richard Hatfield, and he got a phone call from Trudeau, and this was just before the meeting in November 1981. And Trudeau was worried that he only had 2 guys with him, Davis and Hatfield. And Hatfield said to him, Pierre, accept the consequences and do it. A few weeks later, we're in Ottawa for the famous meeting of November 3rd, 4th, and 5th. The night of November 4th, a bunch of reporters are with Hatfield in his suite at the Four Seasons. The phone rings, it's Trudeau's, come over to the house. So he went to 24 Sussex for the meeting with Davis, and then he stopped off at the Chateau Laurier on the way back and saw Sneezy Waters. That was Hatfield's night, But we don't have that kind of intimacy anymore among the first ministers, as Robin said, or for that matter, among the media with them as our counterparts.
Yeah, but I think too, one of the reasons that the federal provincial structure has deteriorated a lot is because I think that it turned into just the provinces deciding what was their wine this meeting and how were they going to gang up on Ottawa in this meeting. And as we touched on earlier, that ability to, maybe we don't have enough national issues, I don't know, but that ability to rally around major national issues and set apart your provincial interests for the good of the country. And I think
look, that depends on the strength of the Prime Minister, surely. I'm with Brian on this one. Mr. Mulroney, Mr. Trudeau never had any problem coming out of those meetings, mostly with what they wanted, even if it was 12 against 1. I mean, you know, that famous Disraeli line, the vote's 12-1 and the ones have it, was very common in those sessions. Mr. Chrétien probably could have done much better in that than he chose to do. I don't know about Mr. Harper. Perhaps it's that he doesn't have an agenda. Perhaps he doesn't have the confidence to challenge them all as a group.
Well, no, I think he also. I mean, I would argue the Chrétien government was incredibly dismissive of provincial, with very rare exceptions. I mean, some of their ministers were just disgusting, frankly, in their treatment of the provincial governments. But I think, with rare exceptions,
you were a minister then, weren't you?
Yes, I was. Yes, I was. And actually, the one exception, was Pierre Pettigrew, who we did the National Child Benefit together. And I don't think very few ministers in the Chrétien government could have done that, because he had some of that consensus building, etc. That was really, really important. But I think Harper has been very clear, has he not, that this is provincial jurisdiction, this is federal jurisdiction, and what he's been trying to do.
That's not what a federation is.
Well, but he's been trying to get out of the let's stop competing in the same space.
No, he's definitely a classical federalist division of powers, 91,
Yes.
92.
But the example you give, which was a great one, and where Romano was chair of the premiers for much of that, the child benefit, we're all proud to do that. That was the last time we tried to do something like that.
No, it is.
And the country pays a heavy price. A very heavy price for
all the
saying we
drama.
never have nothing to work on together anymore.
Rael, forgive me, I got to jump in here because we're plumb out of
Yeah.
time. So let me just say happy anniversary, 40th to the IRPP, and we recommend policy options for the top 5 premiers. Where's Mike Harris on the list? Just curious.
Somewhere in the top 18.
Somewhere in the top 18. Okay.
Well, give him a few years.
How's this for a legacy?
It will age very well.
How's this for a legacy for Peter Lougheed? He never lost a seat. No incumbent MPP in Alberta under Peter Lougheed lost a seat in 4 elections.
Probably.
The man never lost a seat. That's amazing.
Pretty incredible.
My thanks to everybody. Rael Seguin from the Globe and Mail in Quebec City. Thank you for being there on the line. Janet Ecker from the Toronto Financial Services Alliance. Brian Topp from Actor Toronto. Robin Sears from Navigator. L. Ian McDonald from Policy Options. Good stuff, everybody. Thanks so much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.